In the middle of the Hudson River, less than 50 miles from the bustling streets of New York City, a Scottish castle rises from the water like a ghost. But this was not built for royalty. It was not a playground for the aristocracy. Inside these thick stone walls once sat 30 million rounds of ammunition, thousands of cannons, and enough gunpowder to flatten half of Manhattan. This is the legacy of Francis Bannerman VI, the man who turned the waste of war into a $1 million empire. But how did a scrap dealer build a private fortress? And why, after such wild ambition, is the only thing left today a skeleton of charred arches and a terrifying silence? What happened to Bannerman's Island arsenal? The industrial heartbeat of post-Civil War America was nowhere louder than on the waterfronts of Brooklyn. By the late 1860s, the East River was a chaotic artery of commerce, thick with the smoke of coal-fired tugs and the forests of masts from merchant clippers. It was here, amidst the oil slicks and the rotting piers, that the machinery of war was often left to rust. For most, this detritus was garbage, the uncomfortable remnants of a fractured nation trying to forget its wounds. For a young Scottish immigrant named Francis Bannerman VI, it was not refuse. It was inventory. Bannerman was not born into the aristocracy of the Gilded Age. His entry into the world of commerce began at the bottom of the supply chain, dragging the river with a grappling hook from the back of a small skiff. He was a scrapper, a functionary in the ecosystem of waste. His initial trade was simple: retrieving lost anchors, lengths of chain, and fraying hemp rope that the Navy yards had discarded. It was dirty, grueling work, defined by the weight of wet iron and the smell of harbor mud. Yet, even as a boy, Bannerman understood a fundamental economic truth that eluded his competitors. The value of an object was not defined by its current utility, but by its potential for resale. As the United States moved further away from the Civil War, the military began a systematic purge of its surplus. The Union Army and Navy, once swollen to massive proportions, were shrinking back to peacetime levels. This contraction created a market anomaly. Perfectly functional equipment was being liquidated for pennies on the dollar. While other scrap dealers looked at a cannon and saw only the melt value of the bronze, Bannerman saw a cannon. He understood that the world was a volatile place and that peace was rarely a permanent condition. This insight transformed the Bannerman operation from a riverside scavenging effort into a legitimate enterprise. He began attending Navy auctions with religious regularity. He bought when the market was flooded. He bought when prices bottomed out. His philosophy was a direct inversion of the biblical prophecy. He did not want to beat swords into plowshares. He knew that sooner or later, someone, somewhere, would need the sword again. His business model was built on the patience to hold the inventory until that need arose. By the 1890s, the business had outgrown the waterfront and moved to a prominent location at 501 Broadway in Manhattan. The store was less a retail outlet and more of a private armory. It became a destination for revolutionaries, theatrical directors, and smaller nations looking to equip their constabularies on a budget. Inside, the walls were lined with Mauser rifles, Civil War carbines, and endless crates of uniforms. To the casual observer, it was a museum of military history. To Bannerman, it was simply warehousing. The true test of this business model, and the event that would ultimately force the creation of the island fortress, arrived in 1898. The Spanish-American War was brief, decisive, and, for the United States government, logistically overwhelming. The conflict ended with a swift American victory, leaving the military in possession of vast quantities of captured Spanish munitions and their own surplus equipment that was no longer needed. The government, repeating the cycle of the Civil War, moved to liquidate. This was the moment Francis Bannerman had been preparing for. He did not merely bid on a few lots of rifles. He executed a total acquisition strategy. In a move that stunned his competitors and overwhelmed the government auctioneers, Bannerman purchased approximately 90% of the captured Spanish guns, ammunition, and equipment. It was a gamble of unprecedented scale. He bought cartridges by the million. He bought artillery shells by the ton. He bought the physical legacy of a fallen empire, betting his family's fortune that he could sell it off piece by piece for the next half-century. The logic of the purchase was sound, but the logistics were catastrophic. Almost immediately, the physical reality of the acquisition began to strain the infrastructure of New York City. The material did not stay in Cuba or the Philippines. It was shipped north. Barges laden with unstable black powder and live ordnance began to arrive in Brooklyn. The Bannerman warehouses, already stocked with the accumulation of 30 years of trading, were pushed beyond their breaking point. Crates of ammunition were stacked floor to ceiling. Artillery shells were piled in courtyards. The sheer density of explosives concentrated in a bustling urban center was a statistical anomaly waiting for a spark. New York City in the turn of the century was a place of dense tenements, open flames, and rudimentary fire safety. The presence of a private munitions depot of this magnitude, situated in the heart of the commercial district, was not just a zoning violation. It was an existential threat. The city officials, initially tolerant of the quirky Scotsman and his museum-like store, began to view the operation with alarm. The public, too, became aware that the building next door might contain enough explosive power to level several city blocks. The tension was not merely bureaucratic. It was a clash between the unregulated capitalism of the 19th century and the emerging demands of urban safety. Bannerman viewed his stock as private property, no different from textiles or lumber. The city viewed it as a dormant volcano. The friction intensified with every barge that docked, adding more weight to the already sagging floorboards of the Brooklyn storage facilities. The ultimatum, when it finally came, was inevitable. The city's message was clear. The munitions could not stay. The risks to the population were too high, the liability too great. Bannerman was given a choice that was hardly a choice at all. He had to remove the explosive elements of his inventory from the city limits, or face confiscation and the dismantling of the empire he had spent a lifetime accumulating. This regulatory pressure forced a geographical crisis. Bannerman needed a location that was paradoxical in nature. It had to be remote enough to satisfy the safety concerns of the city magistrates, isolated enough to secure the dangerous inventory from theft, yet accessible enough to the shipping lanes of the Hudson River to maintain his global supply chain. He could not simply move to the countryside. He needed a port. He needed a fortress. He needed a place where the laws of the city did not apply, where he could store 30 million rounds of ammunition without a fire marshal inspecting his ledgers. The scrapper from the Brooklyn waterfront had become the merchant of death, and now the merchant of death was being evicted. The search for a new home was not driven by a desire for grandeur or isolation, but by the cold, hard necessity of logistics. The inventory was the lifeblood of the business, and the inventory needed a vault. As the 20th century dawned, Francis Bannerman stood atop a mountain of gunpowder, looking north up the Hudson River, searching for a place to hide his empire before the city shut him down. The ultimatum from New York City created a logistical paradox for the Bannerman operation. The inventory, millions of rounds of ammunition, thousands of rifles, and tons of black powder, required a location that was mathematically difficult to secure. It had to be distant enough to satisfy the fire marshals of Manhattan, yet close enough to the Hudson River shipping lanes to maintain the flow of international commerce. It needed to be isolated to prevent theft, yet accessible enough for heavy barges to dock. The search for this sanctuary fell to the next generation. While Francis Bannerman VI managed the regulatory battles in the city, his son, David, took to the water. The Hudson River was the primary artery of the business, and it was along these banks that the solution had to be found. In the summer of 1900, David Bannerman was rowing a canoe up the river, scouting the topography north of West Point. The landscape here shifts dramatically. The flat industrial sprawl of the lower river gives way to the Hudson Highlands, where steep granite cliffs rise directly from the water, creating a natural wind tunnel and an imposing, almost fortress-like atmosphere. It was here, 50 miles north of the Brooklyn warehouses, that David encountered a rugged, desolate formation known as Polapel Island. From the water, the island appeared hostile. It was a jagged spine of rock, roughly 6.5 acres in size, choked with scrub brush and stunted trees. It lacked a natural harbor and was exposed to the fierce currents that whipped around the bend of the river at West Point. To a conventional real estate developer, it was worthless. It was too small for farming, too rocky for a township, and too difficult to access for a summer resort. But to the Bannermans, who viewed the world through the lens of security and storage, the island's hostility was its primary asset. The isolation of Polapel Island was not merely geographic, it was cultural. For centuries, the local inhabitants of the Hudson Valley had maintained a respectful, fearful distance from the rock. The hesitation was rooted in a layered history of folklore that served as a more effective fence than any barbed wire the Bannermans could install. The indigenous tribes of the region had long avoided the island, believing it to be a dwelling place of spirits. They viewed the land not as soil to be worked, but as a threshold to be avoided. When the Dutch settlers arrived in the 17th century, they imported their own superstitions to overlay the existing ones. They renamed the rock Polapel, and with the name came stories of goblins and mischievous entities that controlled the violent storms plaguing this stretch of the river. River captains would recount tales of strange lights and sudden squalls that seemed to originate from the island's peak. It was said that the goblins of Polapel were the architects of the river's treacherous weather, sinking ships that dared to venture too close without paying respect. By 1900, these stories had evolved from genuine spiritual belief into a persistent local stigma. The island was a blank spot on the mental map of the community, a place where no one went, and therefore a place where no one watched. David Bannerman returned to Brooklyn not with a report on soil quality or timber yields, but with the discovery of a natural vault. He presented the island to his father, not just as real estate, but as a strategic solution. The legends of ghosts and goblins did not deter the elder Bannerman. As a pragmatic Scotsman and a devout Presbyterian, Francis viewed superstition as a distinct commercial advantage. If the locals were afraid to step foot on the island, he would not need to hire nearly as many guards. The folklore provided a perimeter of psychological security that money could not buy. The negotiation for the island was swift. The owners, the Taft family, had little use for a cursed rock that generated no income and incurred tax liability. In November of 1900, the transaction was finalized. Francis Bannerman purchased Polapel Island for a sum that was negligible compared to the value of the inventory it would soon hold. The acquisition was a masterstroke of industrial pragmatism. The island was legally outside the jurisdiction of the New York City fire codes. It was surrounded by a natural moat, the Hudson River, that was deep enough for transport ships but wide enough to prevent casual trespassing. And it came with a built-in reputation that kept the curious at bay. However, the irony of the purchase was absolute. Francis Bannerman, a man who made his fortune selling the instruments of death, had sought a sanctuary to protect his dangerous goods. He found it in a place traditionally feared as a domain of supernatural danger. The locals feared the island because of ancient spirits and goblin storms. Bannerman was about to replace those imaginary threats with a very real, tangible terror. He was not bringing ghosts to Polapel Island. He was bringing 30 million cartridges. He was bringing the physical capacity to level a city. The superstition that the island was dangerous was about to become a self-fulfilling prophecy, but the danger would no longer be metaphysical. It would be measured in tons of black powder and cordite. As the ink dried on the deed, the transformation of Polapel began. The natural silence of the river was broken by the sound of industrial barges. The first shipments were not building materials for a home, but the surplus of the Spanish-American War that had been choking the Brooklyn waterfront. Workers, many of them unaware of the specific volatility of the crates they carried, began to offload the arsenal onto the rocky shore. The island, once the domain of wind and birds, was rapidly militarized. The scrub brush was cleared not for gardens, but for foundations. The uneven ground was leveled not for leisure, but for logistics. The community on the mainland watched from a safe distance. The Goblin Island was now owned by the Merchant of Death. The lights that flickered on the rock at night were no longer attributed to spirits, but to the watchman guarding a stockpile of global warfare. The decision to buy Polapel Island was the pivotal moment that moved the Bannerman Empire from a business to a dominion. In Brooklyn, Francis was a merchant subject to the laws of the city. On the island, he was the sovereign. He controlled the land, the access, and the rules of engagement. He had escaped the constraints of urban safety regulations, but in doing so, he had isolated himself and his family on top of the largest private powder keg in the world. The purchase marked the end of the island as a natural formation and the beginning of its life as a machine. The stage was set for the construction of a facade that would hide this machine, a castle that would project an image of romantic nobility while concealing the cold, hard reality of industrial warfare. With the deed to Polapel Island secured, Francis Bannerman VI faced a construction challenge that would have paralyzed a conventional industrialist. He needed to build a complex capable of housing the most volatile inventory in the world on a remote rock with no infrastructure. and he needed to do it without bankrupting the very business the island was meant to save. A standard military arsenal of the era was a study in grim efficiency, low brick bunkers, earthworks, and strict utilitarian design. But Bannerman was not merely building a warehouse. He was building a monument to his own legacy. He envisioned a structure that would signal his dominance over the surplus market, a physical manifestation of the Bannerman brand that could be seen from the deck of every ship passing up the Hudson River. He did not hire an architect. There were no blueprints drawn up by engineering firms, no structural calculations submitted for municipal review. Instead, the design of the arsenal emerged from the margins of Francis Bannerman's daily life. He sketched his vision on the backs of envelopes, on used napkins, and on the scrap paper that littered his office. His inspiration was drawn entirely from the romanticized past of his Scottish heritage. He wanted a castle. Specifically, he sought to replicate the fortresses of the Clan MacGregor, complete with crenellated towers, turrets, and a moat. It was an architectural fantasy imposed upon an industrial necessity. The construction process that followed was a masterclass in the philosophy of the scrap trade. Just as Bannerman's inventory was composed of the cast-offs of war, his fortress would be built from the cast-offs of the city. He applied the same logic to masonry that he applied to rifles. Why buy new when the old can be repurposed? In the early 1900s, New York City was undergoing a massive modernization of its streets. The old cobblestones were being ripped up to make way for smoother asphalt. To the city planners, these stones were debris. To Bannerman, they were the walls of his castle. He purchased the used paving stones by the barge load for a fraction of the cost of quarried granite. He bought used bricks from demolished buildings in Brooklyn. He salvaged iron girders from scrapped factories. The barges that had once brought ammunition up the river now returned with mountains of urban rubble. The castle rising on Polapel Island was, in a very literal sense, the recycled skeleton of New York City, reassembled 50 miles to the north. But the most distinct feature of the construction was not the stone, but the steel. Concrete requires reinforcement, typically in the form of rebar. Bannerman, however, had a surplus of steel that he could not sell. The walls of the arsenal were reinforced not with standard construction rods, but with the refuse of the battlefield. Laborers, working without the guidance of professional engineers, mixed cement and poured it over layers of rusted bayonets. Old muskets that were too damaged to sell were used as structural supports. The barrels of condemned cannons became corner posts. The very fabric of the building was weaponized. It was a Frankenstein structure, a grotesque but sturdy patchwork where the tools of destruction were repurposed to hold up the roof. As the walls rose, the absurdity of the project became apparent to the local laborers ferried over from the mainland. They were building a medieval fantasy using modern industrial waste. The layout followed no logical grid. It followed the erratic contours of the bedrock and the whims of Bannerman's sketches. Rooms were added as materials became available. Corridors turned at sharp angles to accommodate the jagged terrain. Despite the chaotic methods, the scale of the structure was imposing. The main arsenal building grew to resemble a Scottish baronial manor, looming over the water. It was surrounded by a breakwater, also constructed from refuse. Old barges were intentionally sunk and filled with rocks to create a harbor for the transport ships. Yet, this was not purely a defensive structure. It was aggressive marketing. Francis Bannerman understood the power of visibility. The Hudson River was a major commercial thoroughfare, the highway of the early 20th century. Everyday passenger steamers and cargo ships passed the island. To capitalize on this, Bannerman ordered the construction of a feature that would ensure no one could ignore his presence. On the side of the arsenal facing the main shipping channel, he cast a gigantic inscription into the masonry. The letters were massive, raised relief against the stone, designed to be legible from miles away. Bannerman's Island Arsenal. It was a billboard disguised as a castle. It was a declaration of ownership that turned the entire landscape into an advertisement. The Scrapper King had not just hidden his inventory, he had turned its hiding place into the world's largest signpost. While the arsenal was the center of operations, Bannerman also required a residence. He could not manage such a volatile empire from afar. On a higher point of the island, separated from the main powder magazines, he built a summer home. He named it Cragievar, after a famous castle in Aberdeenshire. Like the arsenal, the residence was a marvel of recycled opulence. The floorboards were salvaged from shipping crates. The decorative ironwork on the balconies was pieced together from scrap metal, yet, from a distance, it looked magnificent. It had gardens, winding paths, and a panoramic view of the Hudson Highlands. However, the luxury of the residence was overshadowed by the reality of its location. The Bannerman family moved into a home that was literally sitting on top of a bomb. The domestic life at Kragujevar played out against the backdrop of industrial danger. The children played in gardens bordered by piles of artillery shells. The view from the porch was not of a serene river, but of the bustling transfer of explosives from barge to bunker. This proximity created a unique psychological atmosphere. The castle was designed to project strength and permanence, but it was built without a foundation of engineering safety. It was a structure held together by gravity, cement, and surplus weaponry. The lack of an architect meant that there were no load-bearing calculations for the immense weight of the ammunition being stored. As the years passed and the inventory grew, the floors of the arsenal began to groan under the strain. The Frankenstein construction held, but it was being tested by the sheer mass of the iron and lead packed inside. The castle looked impregnable from the outside, a stone titan guarding the river. But inside, it was an improvisation, a high-stakes experiment in structural endurance. The completion of the outer walls marked the end of the beginning. The island was no longer just a rock. It was a functioning machine of war commerce. The sign was up, the gates were open, and the barges continued to arrive. Francis Bannerman had succeeded in building his dream. He had turned his scrap into a kingdom. But in doing so, he had trapped his legacy inside a fortress that was as fragile as it was terrifying. By the first decade of the 20th century, the fortress on Polypal Island was no longer a construction site. It was the nerve center of a global distribution network. While the physical inventory was secured behind stone walls and iron gates, the reach of the Bannerman Empire extended far beyond the Hudson Valley. The mechanism for this expansion was not a fleet of ships or a diplomatic corps, but a book. The Bannerman catalog was a literary and commercial anomaly. Published periodically and growing thicker with each edition, it eventually swelled to over 350 pages. It was more than a price list. It was an encyclopedia of warfare. Inside its pages, illustrated with intricate woodcuts and detailed line drawings, was the inventory of the world's conflict. A customer in rural Kansas or a revolutionary in Central America could flip through the catalog and order a Civil War musket for a few dollars, a pith helmet from the British colonial wars, or a fully functional Gatling gun on a carriage. The catalog was distributed by mail order, penetrating markets that traditional arms dealers could not reach. It sat on the shelves of public libraries, in the reading rooms of gentlemen's clubs, and in the barracks of remote outposts. It became known as the Soldier's Bible, a reference manual for collectors and mercenaries alike. The text was dry, technical, and relentlessly efficient. It described the bore, the weight, and the history of each weapon with the precision of a museum curator, followed immediately by a price tag. The democratization of firepower was absolute. The catalog made no moral distinction between a museum director looking to complete a display and a warlord looking to equip a militia. If the money was wired to the office at 501 Broadway, the crates were loaded onto barges at the island and shipped to the customer. This indiscriminate availability created a complex web of clientele. On one end of the spectrum were the innocent consumers. The Boy Scouts of America purchased uniforms and canteens. Theatrical producers on Broadway bought swords and costumes for Shakespearean tragedies. Local police departments bought revolvers. On the other end of the spectrum lay the geopolitical actors. In the turbulent years leading up to the First World War, the Bannerman catalog became a logistical lifeline for insurrectionists. Revolutions in South America were frequently fought with rifles that had been retired by the Union Army 40 years prior, refurbished on Polypal Island, and shipped south. The catalog allowed non-state actors to bypass government embargoes. A rebel general did not need a treaty to arm his men. He only needed a subscription to the Bannerman mail order service. Yet, the architect of this global arms trade was a study in profound contradiction. Francis Bannerman VI was not a cynical profiteer or a warmonger in the traditional sense. He was a devout Scottish Presbyterian, a pillar of his church, and a man of strict personal temperance. He forbade alcohol, profanity, and tobacco among his workers. He taught Sunday school and funded charities. In his personal writings and public statements, Bannerman often expressed a deep hatred for war. He viewed conflict as a wasteful, tragic failure of humanity. He justified his business not as the proliferation of weapons, but as a form of recycling. To him, the sword was already forged. He was merely preventing it from being wasted until it could be turned into a plowshare, or, more likely, used again to prevent a greater waste of resources. He constructed a moral framework that allowed him to sleep at night in his castle above the powder magazine. He argued that by buying up the surplus of the world's armies, he was actually keeping the peace. He controlled the market. He regulated the flow. He believed that the availability of cheap, obsolete weapons helped smaller nations defend themselves against imperial aggression, thereby maintaining a balance of power. This psychological compartmentalization was essential to the operation. The man who prayed for peace on Sunday spent the rest of the week managing the logistics of violence. He would inspect a shipment of bayonets with the same fastidious care he applied to his church ledgers. The cognitive dissonance was woven into the very brand. The catalog often included peaceful philosophical musings in the margins, printed right next to the specifications for artillery shells. The height of this paradox, and the peak of the empire's influence, arrived with the outbreak of the Great War in 1914. As Europe descended into the trenches, the demand for weaponry shifted from the retail market to the strategic level. The surplus that Bannerman had hoarded for decades, often ridiculed as junk by his competitors, suddenly became a strategic reserve. The British Army, desperate for training rifles to equip their rapidly expanding forces, turned to the Scotsmen on the Hudson. Bannerman donated thousands of rifles and cannons to the British government. He outfitted entire regiments of Scottish volunteers. The island fortress, once a storage depot for the unwanted leftovers of 19th century skirmishes, was reactivated as a vital node in the supply chain of the 20th century's first industrial war. The junk was no longer junk. It was the difference between holding a line and losing it. This period marked the financial zenith of the Bannerman Empire. The gamble of 1898, the massive purchase of Spanish war surplus, paid off with exponential returns. The cash flow allowed for the expansion of the island's facilities and the refinement of the castle's interior, but it also cemented the island's reputation. It was no longer just a curiosity. It was a recognized power. The U.S. government, which had once threatened to shut him down, now monitored the island as a critical asset. However, this success brought a new level of scrutiny. The catalog had done its job too well. It had placed high-powered weaponry into the hands of too many unpredictable actors. As the war raged in Europe, anxiety grew in New York about the sheer volume of explosives sitting on a rock in the Hudson River. The Merchant of Death title, once a hyperbolic nickname used by newspapers, began to carry a heavier, more literal weight. Francis Bannerman, aging and witnessing the devastation of the World War he had inadvertently helped equip, began to retreat further into his fortress. The business had succeeded beyond his wildest ambitions. He had proved that scrap was gold. But as the casualty lists from the Somme and Verdun lengthened, the moral defense of his trade began to fray. The weapons he sold were not preventing war. They were fueling a slaughter on a scale the human race had never seen. The catalog, his greatest invention, had become a catalog of horrors. The empire was wealthy, the castle was complete, and the inventory was moving. But the foundation of the business, the assumption that old weapons were harmless until needed, was collapsing under the weight of modern mechanized warfare. By the second decade of the 20th century, Polypel Island had evolved into a self-contained society, governed by a singular, overriding physical law, the prohibition of the spark. While the warehouse complex operated as a global logistics hub, the island was also the summer residence of the Bannerman family. This dual function created a domestic environment of surreal contradictions. Francis Bannerman VI had constructed a grand home, Kragivar, on the highest point of the island, separating it from the arsenals by a carefully calculated distance and a series of stone blast walls. Yet, the separation was merely visual. The reality of living on top of 30 million pounds of explosive ordnance permeated every aspect of daily life. The residence itself was a museum of the macabre. The Bannermans did not decorate with conventional art. They decorated with the inventory. The hallways of the summer home were lined with suits of armor, pikes, and shields. The fireplace mantels were adorned with unprimed artillery shells. For the children, the island was a playground of industrial refuse, where games of hide and seek were played among stacks of Civil War caissons. For guests invited from the mainland, a weekend at the castle was a mixture of Victorian luxury and acute anxiety. They would sip tea on a terrace that overlooked barges being loaded with volatile black powder, the scent of cordite often mingling with the river breeze. To maintain this delicate balance between a family home and a bomb, Francis Bannerman instituted a regime of discipline that rivaled the strictest military encampments. He ruled the island not merely as an owner, but as a warden. The safety protocols were absolute, born of the terrifying knowledge that a single mistake would not result in a fire, but in the erasure of the island from the map. The primary enemy was fire, and by extension, anything that could produce it. Matches were contraband. Smoking was forbidden anywhere on the island, a rule that was enforced with immediate termination for any laborer caught violating it. The prohibition extended to the footwear of the workers. In an era where hobnailed boots were the standard for manual labor, the men on Polapel were required to wear shoes with sewn rubber or leather soles. A single iron nail striking the granite bedrock could generate a spark, and in the dusty air of the powder magazines, a spark was a death sentence. The kitchen at the residence was managed with the precision of a chemistry lab. Cooking fires were strictly contained, monitored, and extinguished the moment they were no longer needed. Heating was provided by a centralized steam system, with the boilers located in a separate reinforced structure at the water's edge, pumping heat up to the house through insulated pipes to ensure that no open flame ever burned within the residential or storage zones. This atmosphere of suppression created a unique psychological burden for the workforce. The laborers, mostly locals ferried over from the towns of Beacon and Cornwall, worked in a state of suppressed tension. They were moving crates of decaying explosives, chemicals that became more unstable with age. Nitroglycerin can sweat out of dynamite over time. Black powder can become hypersensitive to friction. The men were not just movers, they were walking through a minefield of their own making. Every crate lifted was a calculated risk. Every jar set down required a deliberate gentleness. The silence of the island was heavy. Unlike the noisy factories of Detroit or Pittsburgh, the Bannerman arsenal operated in a hush. Voices were kept low, movements were methodical. The clanging of metal on metal, the soundtrack of the industrial age, was strictly minimized here. To enforce this order, Bannerman employed a private security force. The island was patrolled 24 hours a day. The guards were not there to protect the inventory from theft. Few criminals were foolish enough to steal unstable explosives, but to protect the inventory from negligence. They walked the perimeter with guard dogs, checking the locks, smelling the air for smoke, and watching the river for unauthorized boats that might venture too close with a careless lantern. The tension peaked during the summer months, not due to human error, but due to the geography of the Hudson Valley. The region is prone to violent thunderstorms. For a man who had spent his life controlling every variable of his business, the weather remained the one threat Francis Bannerman could not regulate. When storm clouds gathered over the Hudson Highlands, the island went into a state of high alert. The lightning rods installed on the towers of the arsenal were the only line of defense against a direct strike. During these storms, the family would gather in the main room of Kragujevar. As thunder shook the stone foundations of the house, the reality of their situation became impossible to ignore. They were sheltering in a stone house, surrounded by iron conductors, sitting atop a stockpile of gunpowder, waiting for the sky to clear. It was during these moments that the sheer audacity of the Bannerman enterprise was laid bare. No amount of discipline, no rubber-soled shoes, and no perimeter walls could negotiate with a bolt of lightning. The existence of the island relied on a statistical gamble that nature would miss the magazines. As the years wore on, this constant vigilance began to take a toll. Francis Bannerman, the architect of this system, became increasingly consumed by the burden of his creation. He was the only one who truly understood the chemistry of the decay happening inside the crates. He knew that the older the inventory got, the more dangerous it became. The peace of the island was an illusion. It was a state of suspended animation, maintained by will and luck. The workers, too, felt the shift. The initial awe of working at the famous castle faded, replaced by a grim recognition of the hazard. The turnover rate was low, not because the job was desirable, but because the men who stayed were those who could tolerate the pressure. They formed a silent brotherhood, bound by the shared risk. They knew which bunkers to avoid on hot days. They knew which crates to never touch. By 1917, with the world at war and the demand for weapons at its peak, the activity on the island reached a fever pitch. The barges were leaving full, but they were also returning with new, more modern explosives, picric acid and TNT, adding new layers of volatility to the mix. The strict separation between the safe residential zone and the danger zone began to blur as space ran out. The castle, designed to project power and permanence, was effectively a prison for its inhabitants. They were trapped by their own assets. The Bannerman family could leave for the winter, retreating to their townhouse in Brooklyn, but the threat remained behind, guarded by men pacing the dark perimeter, listening to the wind, waiting for the spark that everyone knew, sooner or later, would come. The armistice of November 1918 brought silence to the battlefields of Europe, ending the industrial slaughter of the Great War. Almost simultaneously, a different kind of silence fell over the Hudson Valley. Francis Bannerman VI, the architect of the surplus empire and the warden of Polapel Island, collapsed and died. His death marked a critical structural failure for the Bannerman operation. The business had not been built on a corporate hierarchy or a decentralized management system. It was built on the singular, obsessive mind of its founder. Francis Bannerman did not just own the inventory, he internalized it. He knew the chemical composition of the black powder stored in the North Magazine. He knew the precise age of the artillery shells stacked in the lower bunkers. He understood the temperamental nature of the surplus market and the physical decay of the weapons he hoarded. When he died, the brain of the island was removed. Control passed to his sons, Francis VII and David. They were capable men, raised in the shadow of the arsenal and trained in the logistics of the trade, but they inherited a machine that was already beginning to rust. The psychological gravity that the elder Bannerman had exerted, the terrifying discipline that kept sparks away from powder, began to dissipate. The fear of the patriarch was replaced by the routine of inheritance. The timing of the transition was precarious. With the war over, the global demand for weapons evaporated overnight. The frantic shipments that had defined the previous 4 years ceased. The barges that had once left the island laden with rifles now sat idle at the breakwater. The flow of inventory reversed. Instead of moving out, the surplus of a demobilized world threatened to flood back in. The island was no longer a distribution hub. It was a static container holding millions of pounds of explosives that were slowly, chemically degrading in the summer heat. For 2 years, the system held. The guards walked their patrols. The family continued to summer at Kragivar, maintaining the illusion of a Scottish baronial lifestyle atop the depot. Jane Bannerman, the matriarch, insisted on preserving the routines established by her late husband. She tended the gardens that grew in the thin soil brought over from the mainland, and she hosted tea on the terrace, overlooking the river that had made them rich. But the chemistry of the arsenal did not respect the continuity of the family. The summer of 1920 was stiflingly hot. The humidity of the river valley clung to the stone walls of the fortress, seeping into the ventilation shafts of the magazines. Inside the thousands of wooden crates stacked in the auxiliary buildings, the binding agents in the old artillery shells were breaking down. The black powder, stable when dry, was reacting to the moisture. The sweating dynamite, a phenomenon Francis Bannerman had monitored with paranoid vigilance, was now a silent, unobserved process occurring in the dark. On an afternoon in August, the inevitable finally intersected with the possible. The precise catalyst remains a subject of debate, perhaps a stray bolt of lightning from a passing squall, or perhaps the spontaneous combustion of decaying nitrocellulose. The cause was irrelevant. The physics were absolute. The powder house, a smaller ancillary structure separated from the main castle by a buffer zone, detonated. It was not a fire. It was an eruption. 200 tons of shells and powder ignited in a fraction of a second. The force of the blast was so violent that it did not just destroy the building, it altered the geography of the island. The stone walls of the powder house were atomized. The shockwave slammed into the main castle, blowing out every window in the residence and cracking the masonry of the central tower. In the town of Beacon, on the mainland, the ground shook as if an earthquake had struck. The sound of the explosion rolled down the Hudson River Valley, shattering storefront windows in neighboring towns and rattling teacups as far away as Poughkeepsie, 50 miles to the north. Railroad workers on the New York Central line, miles from the island, watched in disbelief as debris, shrapnel, rocks, and burning timber rained down onto the tracks, forcing trains to screech to a halt. On the island, the scene was one of immediate chaotic violence. Jane Bannerman was inside the residence when the blast hit. The woman who had lived for 20 years with the abstract threat of the arsenal was now covered in the very real shards of her own home. She was thrown across the room by the concussion, cut by flying glass, and deafened by the roar. Yet, in the seconds following the blast, the most terrifying sound was not the explosion itself, but the secondary impacts. Unexploded shells, launched into the air by the initial blast, began to land randomly across the island and in the river, creating plumes of water and localized detonations. The fortress was shelling itself. The psychological firewall that Francis Bannerman had built, the idea that discipline could master danger, was obliterated. The smoke clearing over the river revealed a jagged gap in the island's silhouette. A section of the defensive wall had been blown into the water. The debris field extended into the shipping lane, a physical hazard to the commerce the Bannermans had relied upon. The 1920 explosion was the turning point. It was the first visible crack in the armor of the empire. For 2 decades, the neighbors had feared the island based on superstition and rumor. Now, they feared it based on empirical evidence. The Goblin Island had proven itself to be exactly what the alarmists had warned: a volcano waiting to erupt. Jane Bannerman survived, shaken and bandaged, but she refused to abandon the island immediately. Her decision to stay was an act of defiance, a desperate attempt to prove that the legacy of Francis Bannerman was still viable. The family repaired the windows. They cleared the rubble. They reinforced the remaining structures. But the atmosphere had irrevocably changed. The sense of invincibility was gone. The guards no longer walked the perimeter with the confidence of wardens. They walked with the apprehension of men standing on a fault line. The sons, Francis VII and David, were forced to confront a reality their father had successfully ignored. The inventory was not just an asset. It was a liability that grew heavier with every passing day. The business did not collapse overnight. The catalog continued to be printed. Orders continued to be filled. But the trajectory had shifted. The empire was no longer growing. It was surviving. The explosion of 1920 was not the end of the story, but it was the beginning of the decay. It was the moment the island stopped being a fortress and started becoming a ruin. The first crack had appeared, and gravity would soon do the rest. The detonation of 1920 shattered the windows of the Hudson Valley, but the legislative aftershocks that followed did far more structural damage to the Bannerman Empire than any explosion. In the decades following the First World War, the geopolitical landscape that had allowed Francis Bannerman VI to thrive began to close. The era of the private arms dealer, operating with the autonomy of a sovereign state, was ending. Governments, terrified by the carnage of the trenches and the rise of organized crime during Prohibition, began to tighten the noose around the unregulated sale of heavy ordnance. The National Firearms Act of 1934 and subsequent federal regulations transformed the Bannerman catalog from a weapon of war into a curiosity for collectors. The business did not die immediately. It suffocated. The global network of revolutionaries and warlords that had once filled the order books was replaced by a shrinking list of museums and antique enthusiasts. The barges that used to arrive heavy with artillery shells now arrived empty, and eventually they stopped arriving at all. As the revenue stream dried up, the physical maintenance of Polapel Island became a mathematical impossibility. The castle, built without architects and reinforced with scrap metal, required constant, expensive upkeep. The harsh freeze-thaw cycles of the New York winters gnawed at the masonry. The mortar, mixed by amateurs 50 years prior, began to crumble. By the late 1940s, the island had transitioned from a fortress into a liability. The Bannerman family, now led by the grandson Charles, faced a grim ledger. The cost of securing the island, paying the guards, and repairing the sea walls far exceeded the profit generated by selling rusty Civil War muskets. The Frankenstein architecture was turning against its creators. The recycled bayonets embedded in the concrete rusted, expanding and cracking the very walls they were meant to support. The true death of the island as a functioning entity, however, came not from the land but from the water. For half a century, the lifeline of the island had been a small, rugged ferry boat named the Polapel. It was the umbilical cord connecting the arsenal to the mainland, transporting workers, food, and the family back and forth. Without the Polapel, the island was merely a rock in a strong current. In 1950, a violent storm swept down the Hudson River Valley. the Polypel moored at its dock on the island side, was battered by high winds and churning waves. By morning, the vessel had broken loose and was smashed against the breakwater. It sank in the shallow, murky water of the harbor. Charles Bannerman stood on the mainland dock, looking through binoculars at the wreck of his grandfather's lifeline. He was faced with a binary choice: invest a small fortune to salvage and repair the boat, or accept the verdict of the storm. The inventory remaining on the island was mostly unsold junk, uniforms turned to dust, leather belts rotted by humidity, and cannons for which there was no ammunition. The math was cold and absolute. The family chose not to raise the boat. The sinking of the Polypel was the final severance. The daily patrols stopped. The guards were withdrawn. The massive iron gates of the arsenal were locked for the last time, and the keys were taken to Brooklyn. The island was left to the river, the wind, and the vandals. For the next 17 years, the castle stood in a state of suspended animation. It became a ghost story for a new generation. Teenagers from the mainland, emboldened by the lack of guards, would row out at night to trespass. They found a time capsule of industrial warfare. They walked through the silent halls of the residence, where the furniture still sat under dust sheets. They looted small souvenirs, bayonets, helmets, brass buttons, leaving behind graffiti and broken beer bottles. The discipline of the spark that Francis Bannerman had enforced with such ferocity was replaced by the reckless apathy of abandonment. In 1967, the Bannerman family finally divested themselves of the burden. They sold the island to the Taconic State Park Commission. The state of New York intended to turn the site into a public park, a monument to the valley's history. But bureaucracy moved slower than decay. The state took ownership of the deed, but they did not immediately secure the site. The island remained in limbo, owned by the public but ruled by no one. The volatile chemistry of the remaining inventory sat waiting. Though much had been sold or scrapped, pockets of danger remained hidden in the dark corners of the sub-basements. Oil-soaked floors, crates of old fuses, and the desiccated timber of the floors themselves. Then came the night of August 8, 1969. The summer had been long and dry. The timber skeleton of the arsenal, cured by 60 years of river wind and soaked in the residue of gun oil and black powder, was essentially a vertical pyre waiting for ignition. The origin of the spark remains a mystery to this day. It may have been a trespasser's careless cigarette, a lightning strike, or simply the final, delayed chemical reaction of unstable materials left to rot. Shortly after dusk, a glow appeared in the windows of the main arsenal building. Within minutes, the glow became a roar. The fire that consumed Bannerman's castle was not a normal structural fire. It was an industrial inferno. The flames, fed by the dry, seasoned wood of the floors and the remaining combustible residue, shot hundreds of feet into the air. The intense heat turned the heavy slate roof into a kiln. From the banks of the Hudson, thousands of people gathered to watch the spectacle. The volunteer fire departments from Beacon and Cold Spring could do nothing. There was no working ferry to transport trucks to the island, and even if there were, the risk of unexploded ordnance made approaching the blaze suicidal. They stood on the shore, helpless witnesses to the cremation of an era. The sound of the fire was punctuated by the sharp cracks of small-caliber rounds cooking off in the heat. A final, futile salute from the remaining inventory. The massive oak beams that supported the roof gave way with a thunderous crash. The slate tiles slid into the inferno. The fire burned for 3 days. It hollowed out the castle completely. It stripped away the floors, the roof, the windows, and the interior walls. It devoured the residence, Kragujevar, leaving only the stone shell. The Frankenstein construction was laid bare. The fire melted the lead and twisted the iron, but the stone walls, reinforced with their strange skeleton of bayonets and gun barrels, remained standing. When the smoke finally cleared, the Bannerman arsenal was gone. In its place stood a ruin. The majestic, imposing fortress that had once terrified the valley had been reduced to a jagged, blackened silhouette against the sky. The Merchant of Death had left behind a tomb. The destruction was absolute, but it was also clarifying. The fire had burned away the commercial purpose of the island, leaving only the aesthetic shell. The dangerous stockpile was neutralized by the flames. The island was no longer a powder keg. It was now, officially and permanently, a ruin. The ambition of Francis Bannerman VI had finally been extinguished, leaving his castle to stand as a hollow monument to the futility of hoarding the instruments of war. For decades after the Great Fire of 1969, Polypel Island lay in a state of suspended animation, a scorched black tooth jutting from the jaw of the Hudson River. The flames had stripped away the timber floors, the slate roofs, and the intricate interior carpentry of the residence, leaving behind only the stone skeleton. The Frankenstein architecture, once concealed beneath the veneer of a Scottish baronial fantasy, was now exposed to the elements. The fire had neutralized the immediate chemical threat of the explosives, but it had initiated a slower, more relentless process of destruction. Reclamation by nature. Without a roof to repel the rain and snow of the Hudson Valley winters, the castle began to rot from the inside out. The water that had once been the island's moat now became its internal enemy. It seeped into the porous mortar, freezing and expanding with every drop in temperature, prying the recycled paving stones apart with the force of hydraulic jacks. The vegetation, held at bay for 70 years by the strict discipline of the Bannerman groundskeepers, launched a total invasion. Poison ivy, sumac, and wild vines scaled the walls, finding purchase in the cracks left by the fire. Trees took root in what was once the grand dining hall of Kragievar, their trunks thickening year by year until they pushed the masonry outward. The island was no longer a fortress of man. It was a terrarium of stone and iron. In this era of abandonment, the island underwent a transformation in the public imagination. It ceased to be a site of fear, the Goblin Island or the Powder Keg, and became a site of romantic melancholy. It entered the realm of the picturesque ruin, a category usually reserved for ancient European abbeys, not American industrial depots. This aesthetic shift gave rise to a new industry, the dark tourism movement, fueled by a fascination with urban decay and abandoned history, found a perfect subject in the Bannerman arsenal. Photographers, historians, and urban explorers were drawn to the jagged silhouette. They saw in the crumbling arches not a failed business, but a visual poetry of loss. The very isolation that Francis Bannerman had engineered to protect his inventory now served to preserve the mystery of his legacy. However, the structural reality of the ruins remained critical. The state of New York, technically the owner, lacked the funds to stabilize the massive complex. For years, the island was officially off limits, a dangerous hazard where falling rocks were a daily occurrence. It was not until the formation of the Bannerman Castle Trust in the early 1990s that a dedicated effort began to manage the decline. The trust, a group of local citizens and historians, took on the Herculean task of arresting the decay. They could not rebuild the castle. The cost would be astronomical and the purpose non-existent, but they could prevent it from disappearing entirely. They cleared the invasive vines that were pulling the walls down. They installed steel supports to brace the teetering arches. They built hard hat trails for guided tours, allowing the public to finally step onto the island that had been a forbidden zone for a century. Yet, even with these efforts, gravity continued to claim its due. In December 2009, a catastrophic structural failure occurred. A significant portion of the southeast wall of the Tower Arsenal, the section that had faced the river and proudly displayed the name Bannerman, collapsed. The collapse was sudden and violent. Hundreds of tons of brick and stone crashed down the cliffside, burying the lower shoreline in debris. With it went a large section of the famous inscription. The giant letters, cast in concrete to advertise the empire to passing ships, were reduced to rubble. The billboard that Francis Bannerman had built to ensure his name would never be forgotten was erased by the simple, unyielding physics of erosion. This event underscored the profound irony of the entire enterprise. Francis Bannerman VI had spent his life accumulating the durable goods of war, cannons made of bronze, rifles made of steel, believing that material permanence equaled security. He had built his castle to last 1,000 years, using the discarded tools of destruction to reinforce the walls. Today, visitors who take the boat tour to the island are greeted by a sight that reveals the fallacy of that ambition. Where the walls have crumbled, the Frankenstein nature of the construction is visible to the naked eye. Protruding from the broken concrete are the rusted skeletons of Civil War bayonets and the bent barrels of surplus muskets used by Bannerman as primitive rebar. These weapons, designed to kill, were repurposed to build, and now, in their final state, they are neither weapons nor building materials. They are merely iron oxide, bleeding rust stains down the side of the gray stone. The swords did not become plowshares, they became structural failures. The tour guides lead visitors along the safety paths, pointing out the empty windows that frame the sky. They tell the story of the catalog, the explosion, and the fire. But the most powerful narrative is the one that requires no narration. It is the silence of the Great Tower. The Bannerman Arsenal was a monument to the concept of surplus, the idea that nothing should be wasted, that everything has a future value if stored long enough. Francis Bannerman believed he could freeze time, hoarding the past until it became profitable again. He filled his island with the leftovers of history, hoping to sell them back to the future. But the future did not want them. The millions of cartridges, the thousands of uniforms, and the heavy cannons eventually became obsolete, then dangerous, and finally, worthless. The castle itself, built to house this surplus, has become the ultimate surplus item, a massive, empty structure that serves no function other than to exist as a reminder of its own obsolescence. As the boat pulls away from the dock, returning tourists to the mainland, the view of the island is strikingly similar to what David Bannerman must have seen in 1900. A wild, rocky prominence in the river. The castle is still there, but it is fading. It is sinking back into the geology of the Hudson Highlands. The legacy of Francis Bannerman VI is not the fortune he made, nor the weapons he sold. It is the ruin he left behind. It stands as an unintentional memorial to the industrial hubris of the Gilded Age, a testament to the belief that man could conquer not just the market, but time itself. The scrapper from Brooklyn spent his life gathering the wreckage of the world to build a kingdom. In the end, his kingdom became the wreckage. And in the quiet of the river valley, stripped of its roof and its guns, the castle has finally found the one thing Francis Bannerman never sold: peace. The Hudson River continues to flow past Polypel Island today, indifferent to the ruins standing on its banks. The water remains, but the ambition of men eventually crumbles into the soil. Francis Bannerman VI spent his life preparing for the next war, hoarding the tools of destruction in a castle built to last forever. Yet, his legacy was not preserved by stone or steel. It was consumed by time. It forces us to ask a difficult question. What are we building today that will truly endure? And is the pursuit of a permanent legacy simply a trap for those who cannot let go of the past? I invite you to share your perspective in the comments below. Was Francis Bannerman a visionary of logistics, or was he a prisoner of his own greed? If you found value in this journey into the lost chapters of American industry, and if you want to uncover more stories of rise, fall, and the lessons left in the ashes, please subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. There are many more abandoned empires waiting to be discovered. Until the next chapter.